Well, welcome to our last video segment about crop budgets and leasing tool. And in this one, we'll be talking about how to interpret a simulation result from the budget and lease tool. At this point, I'm assuming you have looked at the other video lectures so you understand what's going on, because I'm going to jump right into the results that we get from the last video lecture. All right, well, after you run the simulation, and again, it will pull 200 simulations, 200 iterations, and it will calculate the results it gets for both the tenant and landlord. And this is the type of distribution you get for returns. Now this is called a CDF because it shows you basically at any given point here what's the probability of getting a certain return or lower. So let's just look at this little point right here where with the share lease for a tenant, at this point we're getting a return of, it looks like about -25 or lower about 30% of the time. And this table really kind of summarizes what's going on over here. So again, there's directions of how to show what's going on and everything. And you can see what way you interpret these tables from this direction is that for a given probability of 40%, that's saying you're going to earn that return or lower 40% of the time. Now you can take that on the inverse and look at the other way. You can say, well, if 40% I'm going to earn that return, that given level of return or lower, that means 60% of the time I'm going to earn that potential return or higher. As you move over here to the higher returns, now you're saying you're going to get, like for the cash lease for the tenant, 80% of the time I'm going to get at least a $33 return, but it could very well be lower. 20% of the time I will actually earn a return higher than this $33 you see right here. Okay, so let's look at the landlord, because maybe it might be a little bit more interesting case here, because I think you can see the difference between a share versus cash lease pretty readily. Well, if pretend you're a landlord and you have land rented out as a cash lease. Well, that's a pretty riskless return to you, because you're going to get that return every single year. And you can see one of the defining characteristics of how these shapes of these graphs look like. So here, this blue line right here is the cash lease, and notice it's actually a straight vertical line up and down. So now the more vertical the line is, the less risk there is, and this is saying basically there's zero risk with this return to the landlord, because from 0 to 100% of the time you're going to get this $50 per acre. As things become more risky, notice here the lines become less vertical and more horizontal. So another rule of thumb to remember is that with the CDF, the more horizontal the line, like you see here, the more risk you can take, whereas the more vertical the line, the less risk you have. So that's why from a landlord's perspective, cash leases are nice, because there really is less risk involved with that at all, or no risk involved with that at all, actually. Whereas the share lease from landlord's perspective is pretty risky from his point of view, because there's quite a range of values you can see happening here. And if you go back and look at the table, you basically see for a share lease for a landlord, there's 20% of the time your return is going to be $33.70 or lower. Well, 80% of the time it's going to be higher than that. And the same thing over here at the 50% level, we're saying that 50% of the time you're going to have a return of $47.20 or lower. 50% of the time is going to be higher. Now contrast that with when we go back and look at the original expected value for this one-time situation where we had a 50 bushel yield and a $5.50 price. Notice just for that combination, we were expecting to get a $63 return as a landlord. Now the reason why the 50% level is not at 63, it's more like in the neighborhood of right around here in the $50 range or so, or a little bit lower. Actually, probably right about here at about 48 or so. Actually, well, it says right here, 47.20. The reason why that's not the 63 is because when we did our original analysis here, look at our triangle distribution. We had a higher or more chance of having this lower yield here, $30 or 30 bushels when the average was expected to be 50 versus the top end was only 10 bushel higher. So bigger downside on yield. Same thing with price. There was a bigger downside item for price than there was on the upside here. So that's the reason why when you look at the output, this median point that you see right here at the 50% probability level, why that's not 63, it's only about 47.20, because there is a bigger low end for that. And it's pretty spread out, pretty horizontal, so there's quite a risk to the landlord. So, I mean, you can get higher returns, certainly, above this $50 for the cash rent. You know, in some cases, you're going to be making up to $75, but again, that's only going to occur probably, 5% of the time. And you also got, probably 5% of the time, you're probably going to lose or probably only have a return probably under $25 too. So quite a range of outcomes you could have for a landlord. And just think about your typical landlord, probably someone who's retired, getting up in years. They don't want to take on a lot of risk. That's why cash leases look so attractive to them. The other thing to notice about this lease is you can also see the price flex lease, which is this gray line. Again, it parallels the $50 mark, and then it kind of veers upward again. Now, the reason why it's that shape goes into how you actually set that flex lease up for the price side of things. Remember, we set this thing up so that you didn't allow for any downward adjustment right here. You're saying basically that $50 is the minimum I want to take. I'm willing to flex, but I'm only willing to flex in the upward direction. That's why the line here is this vertical all the way up, and then it finally veers upward when we get some yields that are above that 50 bushel mark. Let's go back to that lease again and just try something happens if you take that off and say, okay, I'm willing to take $50, and I'm also willing to, as a landlord, let that flex both upward and downwards. Now that gives you more risk if you're the landlord. Let's run the simulation now and see what happens with that. Again, we're just waiting for the computer to do this because it has to do this every time. All right, so again, there's our 200 iterations, and here's our output. Now notice what happened with the price flex. Because we allowed for both upward and downward both, now this is the kind of distribution you get. It looks almost very similar to what happened with the yield flex here. So again, that adds more risk to the landlord. Now, from the tenant side, now you're taking on risk almost in every situation. Now, there is some, as you might guess, some risk reduction by taking on a share lease, because you're letting the landlord share some of that. And that's why this orange line is a little more vertical than the other lines. But really, I mean, from a tenant's perspective, yeah, it's a little less risky, but really, the share leases don't really provide necessarily a whole lot, at least in this particular case, compared to what you see over here for the landlord. That may be another why you see a lot of leases kind of shifting toward the cash thing, because again, just this one particular case looks like that, tenants save some degree of risk by taking on a share lease, but it shows up a lot more for the landlord by having a cash lease as opposed to a share lease. So something to keep in mind. The last thing this tool shows you then is it also does a little bit of a land value calculation. I think this is a graphic artifact here in this. Let me see if I can get it to come. There it goes. All right, so it will show you potential land values based on the distribution of returns that we saw here. So based on what your interest rate is and kind of where we expected the yields and prices end up, you could pay anywhere from, if you want to pay anywhere from, at a 5% interest rate, maybe $1,500 an acre. If you had some really good yields, down to this point here where you'd probably pay something less than $500 per acre. So again, a wide variation in what the potential land price would be. But and here's kind of the expected value in here. So that's another way you can use this tool, is based on what the yields and prices are and look at the distribution, you can get an idea of what you might be willing to spend for land if some ever came up for sale at these different interest rates here. So again, the different things you can see from this particular tool. That will actually conclude my lecture about how to use our crop budget and leasing tool. I hope you enjoyed it, and we plan on making changes and improvements as we go along with this thing.